This is Wild Ones Greater Baltimore. My name is Amanda Ray, and we are doing a talk on winter habitat with Dr. Sean McCausham. And today's talk is about creating robust winter habitat with hibernacula. I hope I've said that right. Shelters, food, and water. So this is going to be an engaging and informative presentation on the ways we can create crucial habitat resources for wildlife in winter. The topics in the talk include creating spaces for toads and amphibians to hibernate, insect life cycles, winter birds, providing food resources, and hydration stations. Ideas and processes are contextualized as they historically occurred in the landscape with clear applications to garden design. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Sean McCausham, a conservation ecologist, certified wildlife biologist, and author with expertise in pollinator and plant communities. His published works include scientific peer-reviewed articles, educational articles, and videos on insect and wildlife habitat, wildlife gardening books, and a variety of informational pieces. He's worked across the country on restoration and conservation projects, as well as collecting data, publishing papers, and studying ecosystems, habitats, insects, and wildlife life cycles. His expertise and experience brings restoration practices, wildlife life cycles, and gardens together to create robust habitats in gorgeous urban landscapes. And I know that you all have a gorgeous urban landscape. You've been working with native plants. So again, this is Wild Ones Greater Baltimore, and we're really glad to have you here. The organization is nationwide, and there's over 9,000 members in 35 states. And we welcome you to formally join us with a membership if you are able to do that. And you just need to go to wildones.org/join to do that. All right, I'm going to go ahead and let Sean take over. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amanda. I'll just start by sharing my screen so that we can get to the presentation. And there we go. Okay. So real fast about me is I work currently as a consulting wildlife biologist and help solar farms and wind farms kind of get through the public processes and permitting issues. In the past, I've worked for non-government conservation agencies. I've worked in partnership with government agencies to do conservation, and I've worked for private conservation organizations as well. I bring a bunch of research and background information to all those conservation projects and have been learning with everyone that I do. So I'm excited to bring that information here to this presentation and talk about some of the things that I find are typically left out of conservation practices, and then narrowing that down to what we can do in our urban environments. Before I get started, I definitely want to thank Amanda Ray for inviting me to speak today and the Wild Ones Greater Baltimore area. So in this talk, we'll start talking with some of the ecology and how urbanization, landscape design affects things that are going on in the landscape. I'll move into providing year-round habitat and overwintering spaces, and then how to add structure with natural woods, mulch, soil, and stone habitat designs. And then peppered throughout all of this will be seasonal maintenance, small-scale disturbance, pruning, trimming, and sculpting plants, all these things that we can do to make our urban areas meet codes that might be in place and provide habitat for the wildlife, which is the main goal of what we're doing. So to start off, let's zoom way out and look at what are ecosystems and succession. And most of us will have learned about ecosystem succession through a model that looks something like this, where annual or herbaceous plants colonize the land. Those grow for a few years as perennial plants also begin to colonize that area. That gives way to shrublands and then saplings of forest, and that eventually leads to a climax community of a forest. Then some sort of catastrophe happens and everything resets and we're back to this herbaceous plant community. And although this model does offer a really good beginning footstep, it really doesn't give us the full picture and leads us to having a lot of mistakes. And part of that is because that kind of process really only happens in very unique situations, such as new islands forming in the ocean, which only 4 have formed in the last 150 years, major landslides, and then lava flows. Instead, what's happening when there's some type of catastrophe in most situations is that the plant material and the resources that existed in that plant community still are present in the landscape, and the herbaceous plants begin colonizing again because the sun can reach the ground. So a different way to think about this is when you see an article about creating pollinator habitat or creating wildlife areas in your garden, most of them focus on plant lists, and many of them ignore habitat, which includes the non-floral resources that are important for so many animals. Most people who are doing gardening tend not to manage a forest in their backyard, but instead focus on the meadow to the forest edge type habitat. So if we zoom in on what this natural community would exist in the historic timeline, we would be seeing herbaceous meadows being filled with tall snags, laying down pieces of wood, as well as all of the underground structures that a forest would be growing. This is feeding a nutrient cycle. This is, as time goes on, that wood breaks down. Various animals are going to use the wood in different stages. Some animals need fresh wood for eating, like many of your xylophilus beetles. Those create nests for bees that nest above ground. As that wood decays, it creates a warmer environment, typically holds more moisture. That's used by a lot of nesting reptiles, including snapping turtles, red-eared sliders, and then overwintering organisms like toads, amphibians, newts, and even some bees prefer that really broken down wood. So we want to make sure that we're understanding what this overall habitat should look like and kind of get rid of the ideas that we've been told through the plant list of what should be in our meadows. In addition to that model, the other thing that's missing is all of the habitat engineers that exist or existed in pre-colonization times. Most of the large megafauna on our continent have been extirpated, or their populations have been severely reduced, except for deer. But all of these animals played major roles in disturbances, in creating shelters for other organisms, in browsing plants, which allowed sunlight to get further down into the plant community, but also triggered better growth from those plants, which is why some plants, if they're not disturbed, become really scraggly and fall over, or if you go and give them what's called the Chelsea chop or trim them back in the middle of their growth period, they grow back more robustly. And it's because they need that feedback system that's no longer present. So all of these animals had some role, and some of them were browsing plants and spreading seeds. Many of them create burrows and shelters. All of them are feeding into nutrient cycles. Some of them are creating important disturbances that other wildlife are dependent upon. And I'm pausing because I meant to highlight something in this. Oh, nutrient cycles. So one of the biggest nutrient cycles and most important nutrient cycles in North America that has been so severely disrupted, most people don't even think about it anymore, is the nutrients carried from the ocean into the interior of the continent on an annual basis. And this happened because salmon would travel up our streams that were not dammed, and then bears would feed on those salmon, which would die off every year. Those nutrients would be carried into the ecosystem through the bears and spread out, which feeds a lot of the plants that became dependent upon them. In areas like Alaska and parts of Canada where these bears are still able to do this, we see a very different assemblage of plants compared to the areas where the bears have been removed or the rivers have been dammed. And we're attributing this to that just the lack of nutrient cycle, but also the reality that all these nutrients that come from the ocean and make it inland every year are disappearing. So many of our habitats are degrading in one way or another unless we start to step in and make some changes. So even if we step out to some of the beautiful natural areas that exist, this is a meadow up in New Hampshire where a fire had swept through about 5 years before. We can see, the dead wood is present, live trees, there's some succession happening, the plants are here, but we are still missing the massive animals that should be here as well. There should be larger herds of elk, moose, deer that would have been browsing this forage down. There should be beavers, which would be flooding it. So even if you go out and look at these landscapes and want to bring it back to your house and emulate it, understand that you're only taking an idea that's already a little bit out of its natural state, and we're going to break the network. So all the animals that you see in the same square footage that your house has, most of those animals can survive in that area because they are networked to the surrounding landscape. And when we start to emulate things in an urban landscape where there's a lot of lawns, a lot of cement, we're detaching that. So it is understandable that we should see less abundance of those animals, but will also see an increase in some of the populations that are no longer being predated upon, and that can lead to issues. So I'll talk about how to monitor and things to keep an eye out for, which a lot of people think just let nature take its course in the urban environment. And instead, what we're really doing is letting a rock roll down the hill without any breaks, and it can be kind of damaging. So we don't want to do that. If we take a winter aspect of a meadow as well, this is one of the conservation areas in New York. This did not have any of the big animals that should be present on this, except for deer. And you can see just smooth fields of snow. This is a week after a snow event had happened. There's some structure. The plants, the woodier plants are staying up. The vegetation that grew tall has now been pushed down that was soft. But there should have been clearing of this snow from larger animals moving through here, from wolf packs moving through, and from people moving through. Because that disturbance of the snow isn't happening, many of the herbivores like deer aren't able to access the forage that would be present on the ground. Also, many birds that forage on the seeds that are going to be pressed into the ground don't have access to the soil anymore. One other thing about snow is, although it is cold, it is an insulator. So when it is -20 outside with a layer of snow, the ground doesn't get as cold as if it's -20 outside and there's been no snow. With animals disturbing snowpacks and exposing the ground and the soil for other animals to get into, it also exposes that ground level to more intense colds, and that chills the ground even longer. And some seeds and some plants actually need those longer periods of cold, which is why we're seeing in some gardens or in some areas, plants are shifting northward because they're not getting cold enough winter temperatures like they used to when animals were disturbing the snowpack. So to kind of hammer this home when we bring it back to our yards, is if we are thinking about creating wildlife habitat in our yards and we're only thinking about plants, we're really only need a picture that looks like this. But if we start to look at our yards from the wildlife's perspective and start asking, what does this need to survive for a full year? Where does it shelter for the winter? Where does it shelter in the summer? What are some of the microhabitats that it needs for completing its life cycle? Many amphibians need water for a period of time. Many insects need water for a period of time. Native bees need specific nesting sites, be it soil or above ground. And then, of course, predatory animals like our amphibians need prey. And then we need to ask, is there enough prey habitat? Is there enough food for the prey? And overall, is there enough food for the animal? And that will give us a more robust picture of what we should be planting and designing in our yards. That includes both above ground and below ground. When we're looking at those resources, though, we need to understand how they should exist in the landscape. So earlier we talked about how the models of plant succession kind of miss out on the non-floral resources that would also be present in the landscape. And any ecosystem that you're looking at in North America is going to have some sort of transient vegetation community over time if it was left alone. There are small sporadic rainfall and drought that's going to affect plant establishment and plant die-off. Forests and grasslands are going to have fires. There's going to be pest outbreaks. There's going to be floods. So all of these ecosystems that exist, when we look smaller at their habitats, they should have resources like wood replenishing because of this transient plant community. When we are in the wild, however, or when we're looking at our yards, typically we are not trying to facilitate plant community succession. Instead, we're trying to manage for that plant community. So when I was working in Nevada, this is Lee Meadows. It's right outside of Las Vegas, but it's at 10,000 feet or 9,000 feet. And this has been managed by the Fish or the U.S. Forest Service as a meadow for over 100 years. Because they want this to be a meadow, they've suspended the plant and habitat succession by preventing woody encroachment. Typically in our gardens, we do the same thing. We don't really want trees to start showing up in places where we want our full sun meadow plants growing. In most cases, both in the wildlands and in our home environments, we are going to remove or regulate the interval of disturbance. And this is because we're prioritizing the vegetation community over the ecosystem or the habitat that we are trying to see. And unintentionally, what happens is habitats start to degrade. Populations that are dependent on these habitats don't move like they should with the transient vegetation community over time, and therefore actions need to be taken. This meadow that we're looking at right here, like I said, has been managed as a meadow for over 100 years. Invasive animals have been able to come up and mow it down. The soil is degraded, the nutrients are missing in most of this. Our job was to try and restore this meadow by planting and seeding it with the meadow plants that should exist. And in most places, that did not take. However, in one of the areas that we did, or in two of the areas that we did the outplanting, we had also mulched everything with local trees and local down limbs. 7 years later, those plants are still doing okay, but everywhere else that we seeded isn't. And part of that is because these meadows are dependent upon the breakdown of woody materials and building that soil back up. So in contrast, this meadow has been managed this way for over 100 years, where a similar meadow on the same mountain that had burned 5 years before, we can see it should be tall, 3 to 4 feet tall in grasses and shrubs. There should be saplings growing back. There should be trees and everything else. So again, when you're outside and in our natural lands, make sure that you start to put a filter on that. Even though we're in the natural environment, it's no longer in the balance that it should be from 400 years ago. So first, introduction of some of the maintenance that we'll talk about. With the meadows or full sun environments that we have in our gardens, many people are trying to bring this idea of leave the leaves, which is a fantastic and important step in the nutrient cycle for many meadows. However, in a natural environment, leaves should be falling and then blown around a little bit. Many meadow plants cannot grow through a thick leaf layer. So if we're taking all the leaves that fall on the driveway and the roof and the road and pile them on, you can unfortunately create too thick of a mulch or too dense of a layer for the plants to come back year after year. So make sure that's being spread out. The meadow that's being pictured here on the left is in New York. The landowners had been doing leave the leaves in quotations for about 6 years, but they were collecting all the leaves from the driveway, from the road, and from the lawn and putting them in this area. So we had to come in and just disturb all this leaf litter, pull it all up, and there was literally just layer after layer after layer of leaves that so many of the seeds couldn't establish through, and the plants that had lived underneath it were unable to grow through, so they all died out. Also keep in mind that many of the plants that are growing in these open meadow or in our full sun areas would not naturally grow next to a tree, so they're not going to be used to that leaf fall. Different trees can also produce pH changing leaves. Pine trees, for example, create more acidity. Oak trees are known to produce a little bit more robust or neutral. Some trees actually produce toxins that suppress plant growth around them, most famously being eucalyptus, which is non-native, but it is the best example. The best way to incorporate leave the leaves in your yards is to create piles and tuck those piles of leaves underneath trees, in deep shade areas, or underneath secured branches. The animals that are using leaf piles don't ride the leaves down to the ground from the canopy. That'd be a terrible life strategy, and there are a few insects that do that, but for the most part, animals are finding areas that are already in the microhabitat they need, and then the leaves are adding extra insulation, so they are choosing that pile, not ending up in that pile. The other thing is, if you're going to do deep layers of mulch, make sure that you've marked where your plants should be growing out, and then in the beginning of spring, go ahead and just pull the leaves away from the stems so that they can come up and see the sunlight when they start to emerge. So a real life example of how the leaves should look. This is a giant oak tree, very healthy oak tree in Alabama, I think, if I remember correctly. And the leaves had just fallen off. You can see that there is still herbaceous plants able to be seen underneath the plant, but the leaves have blown into the taller shrubby materials, and that's where insects would be nesting, as well as any wildlife that is looking for a more insulated place to overwinter. So we go back to the idea of the garden that is looking at habitat. How this is functioning in the winter is sandy soils that have been nested in by animals. These are immobile, so they aren't able to move or find new places. So this is typically selected by the builder for under the assumption that they understand what's going on and everything should survive just fine. Creating sandier soils underneath, we'll talk about this more later on in the presentation, is important for a lot of nesting bees. Producing organic material underground mimics the root systems of trees that either die naturally or would have been killed in that community shifting event. Like I said earlier, turtles will nest in that area, but a number of different insects, including moths, crickets, beetles, will bury down into those areas to pupate because it's a little bit warmer, but it's also easy for them to move because most of them are non-fossorial, meaning they can't excavate soil the way that other animals can. Have different diameters of logs around because the log works as an insulator. The outside will get cooler when exposed to colder temperatures, and the inside will stay a more constant temperature. Untrimmed plants will hold up snow, again creating an insulated layer that's at least at a minimum a windbreak, but also will typically stay warmer from the organic material underneath, keeping it warm as it breaks down. And warm in comparative to the outside wind chill temperature or overall lows of the evening. And if we do this correctly, you will start to see your animal populations become more robust in the spring and summer. But if it's done very well, you should start to see the animals that are active during the winter and traces that they are around as well. Like here where chipmunks are running in and out of some of the logs that we had placed out in one of the meadows. When you're creating your habitats, the other thing to consider is what is the overwintering strategy of the wildlife that you are trying to promote in your yard. Again, our yards aren't going to be able to support the entire ecosystem that once exists in that area, but we can try and support a few different animals and in turn have the umbrella effect where animals that are associated with them will also be able to succeed. Many insects overwinter at some stage of their life. Many do it in egg, which is immobile. Some do it in their instars, like caterpillars or early nymph stages. Some insects, like mourning cloaks and crickets, overwinter as adults. Many amphibians overwinter as adults as well, and they hunker down and hibernate. They do not come out. There's a little bit of warm temperatures, they stay down for the entire time. Whereas there's a number of birds, most mammals, and even some insects that are active during the winter months. In contrast, there are a number of animals that say, nope, not doing the cold, and they migrate south. So keep that in mind as well when you are planning for your yard, because some animals that are going to be present in our gardens are not going to be present in the winter, and that's wonderful as well. So an example of animals that are going to be active at different parts of the year is the Luna moth. These typically have 2 generations in the Connecticut or the Northeast area. The spring and summer population forage, feed, find an old leaf pile, nestle down, and emerge in the late summer. This life cycle continues, and then in the fall, when the 5th instar occurs, it climbs out of the tree, crawls around the ground looking for protected areas like hollow logs or underneath large branches where leaf piles have secured and where they're not necessarily getting soaked. There's somewhat of a dryness. They're looking for a specific humidity, and that's when they will create their cocoons and nestle down for the winter and wait it out in an immobile stage. Similarly, the monarch butterfly, one of the animals that I study, especially its ecology, is one of the best studied organisms when it comes to insects. And although monarchs migrate south for the winter, the things that feed upon monarchs don't. So the host specific Tachinid fly, which is pictured here in the center, Pteromalus cassotis, which is a pupal parasitoid, the generalist predators like ants, wheelbugs, and Polistes wasps, these all survive the winter in our gardens. And if we're monitoring our monarch populations or any of our wildlife populations and realize that there are things eating them that are becoming too abundant, it is honestly the best course to take some action. Simply because, again, our gardens are not in that network in a wild landscape, and the things that should be curbing the populations of the predators or the natural enemies aren't going to be present. And if we understand how these organisms overwinter, we can try and modify some of the habitat in our yard to prevent them from finding space. Polistes wasps typically overwinter in trees underneath bark. We believe Pteromalus cassotis overwinters as a pupa in the ground. So if we're finding infected chrysalises, it's important to remove them. Wheelbugs typically overwinter as eggs. Ants overwinter underground in their nest, and tachinid flies overwinter as pupa in the ground as well. So an example of creating some type of disturbances when you realize that the populations are a little bit out of whack is presented here on the right. So this is Pinecroft Meadows in New York. It was another area that I was in charge of managing. And after doing some monarch monitoring where I collected caterpillars, looked at what the survival rate was and what the parasitization rate was, we realized that this meadow that had been managed as a meadow for 60 years was really just feeding the organisms that eat monarchs and not really helping the monarch population. And because the managed system that we do is prioritizing it as a meadow and suspending that habitat succession, it is allowing parasites, predators to build up. There are ways that we can change the way that we are managing that system to improve the habitat just by simply modifying the interval of disturbance. It's still prioritizing the vegetation community, but it should help make populations move around a little bit and recreate some of the non-flora resources that this whole habitat is dependent upon, and then we also need to add some things. So in this case, we knew that those parasitoids and natural enemies were present in the landscape, but we don't necessarily know exactly where they were going. So what we decided to do is right after the monarchs pupated, we went in and mowed half of the meadow pretty low to the ground to hopefully remove any of the sites that these animals would have overwintered or chosen to. And that leaves half of the area for the other animals that are taking or living in this habitat. It gives them access to a new floral resource the following year. In doing it the way that we did, instead of just cutting down half of the meadow in a straight line, we left little islands of plants, and this was to create bird shelter. So when snow falls, it will create a little umbrella under here, and birds can fly up into this, still eat seeds if they're present, but also get out of the wind, out of the severe cold, and seek shelter in any of the storms. So you can see those islands of goldenrod that were present around here. But again, simply by interrupting this, we're also suppressing these late succession meadow plants and hopefully promoting the earlier meadow plants like black-eyed Susan, some of the milkweeds, and a few others. So although having a meadow like this, some of you might be lucky enough to have this much acreage or living in a place where 2 or 3 acres is the minimum plot size, but most people are going to be dealing with something about the 1/10 of an acre when we're talking about gardens and housing developments. And luckily, there's already a lot of garden designs that are inspired from nature. And it's up to you on when you are out in the world, what kind of habitat you want to create and what kind of garden design you want to adopt. And once you settle on those, then you can start looking at ways to build structure with plants and rocks, which is typically done in garden designs that are not lawn focused. You can create structure with plants, and you can also modify the plant structure through pruning, which is a natural process through browsing of animals, and simply just create the shapes that you want. Most wildlife are not going to be too concerned with the shape of the plant when we're pruning them. You also want to have clear borders like paths, mowed areas, or use of rocks, etc., so that people can see what you're doing is intentional. This is especially true if you're dealing with county ordinances, city ordinances, and planting in your front yard and dealing with nosy neighbors. So when we're doing or creating our landscapes, it's important to ask ourselves what resources are missing. So we can look at our habitats from the specific wildlife that we are trying to promote, but we can also look at the natural environments around us and start asking, what do we no longer allow to be in these urban environments that really should be? Some of the things that are typically destroyed when we start urbanizing areas is soil diversity. That includes the depth, the texture, and the slope. Native plant communities are typically removed, as most of us are already aware of. Ecosystem engineers, especially burrowing animals, are extirpated, as well as large megafauna. Caves and crevices are typically filled in. Large, clean, temporary water resources as well are filled in. And then woody materials, and leaf litter, things that people see as dying or decaying, are typically removed as well, but they do serve important functions in our gardens. So let's start talking about designing gardens from the ground up. And if you are lucky enough to live in an area where the ground wasn't really heavily modified to build the houses, that is awesome. You probably don't have to worry about this. However, if you're living in a housing development, like I do now here in Texas, there's not a lot of actual soil present, and most of the area was heavily modified, bringing in clays and heavy sands for structural purposes for the roads and the houses. In doing that, and then planting lawns on top of it, most people who plant trees or shrubs near my house or in my neighborhood typically find that their plants are dying, and it's because there's not enough soil or enough space for those plants to actually grow underground. So keeping that in mind, understanding that perennial plants can have deep roots, especially in uplands, we want to make sure our garden beds are deep enough. And a good rule of thumb is to go at least 6 inches below the freeze line in winter. So if you don't know what your freeze line is, there are a number of fairly inexpensive ground thermometers, and you can see how deep it is. There are also some counties that give reports on how deep the freeze or the freeze is going into the soils. Garden beds should always have an appropriate depth, which I said about 6 inches more than the frost line. Shallow soils will lead to sick plants. It will also lead to animals not being able to escape the cold and dying over winter. Having deep native soils will give burrowing animals enough area to escape the weather, as well as enough space for your plants to grow and remain healthy. So when you're looking at recreating removed resources and the soils that are there, it's important to understand what the soils kind of look like in your area to begin with. In a natural area, it's very easy to overlook what the diversity of soils exists because it's covered in plants. However, there's a few ways that you can start to pay attention to those things the next time you're out. If you see any creek beds cut through, see where the roots are existing. It's typically on top, and then there'll be a nutrient-poor soil underneath. So this will give you an idea of where your nutrient-rich soil should be. If trees are falling over, this is another way to gauge where the soils that plants are growing in, how deep that is. And that'll typically lift up. This creates a whole new habitat, and then nutrient-poor soils are exposed down here. Burrowing animals typically expose soil textures as well as deposit nutrient-poor soils into areas that then begin working their way into the nutrient cycle of the plants breaking down every year. And if there have been any fires will sometimes break at soil lines, typically due to rich humus layers or compaction. So you can look at if there's been any fire lines, the types of soils that might exist in your area. Another thing to keep in mind is that natural ecosystems have topography. So when trees fall over, when animals are burrowing, when plants die and decay, this creates topography. And out here in the Southwest that you can see right here on the right, when large shrubs decompose or when burrowing animal towns start to collapse, they create these divots. And the rain in the area simply runs off, carries the seeds into these areas, and you get these pollinator oases. Now, of course, in the Southwest, that makes sense because a few millimeters more of water is going to make a huge difference. But this does carry over to the Northeast, where you have a lot more rain, in that seeds are going to be carried into these areas. It's going to create different plant populations. Similarly, there are topographic on a larger scale changes where you'll get these fern fens or these little groves where water just can't really escape this area, but it's also not, the soil is porous enough that it is allowed to drain out, so it's not actually wetland. In comparison, when you look at restoration projects or even a lot of the old agricultural fields, it's smooth. So this is a stream that was reconstructed after there was a major pipeline put through here. And you can see that they just graded and rolled everything so it's smooth and then applied the seed. This picture here on the right is an old agricultural field that's been left to turn to forest. And you can see that it's still really smooth. It's going to take another 100 to 200 years for this soil to reform like it does in the old growth, where you should have bumps and divots that animals are going to be able to seek shelter in, find water in, and really affect the local microhabitats of those areas. Some of the soil types that you can bring into your yard can be classified using the ternary diagram, which is pictured right here. Classifying your soils based on the ternary diagram is just laying out the percent of sand, silt, and clay that you have present. There are a number of videos on how to do this. It takes about 24 hours, a jar, your soil, and some water. You shake it up and you mark layers as they settle out at 1 minute, 1 hour, and 1 day. Once you know what your soil is, you can start to see if you actually have soil diversity on your property. And soil diversity is important because wildlife use soils in different ways. Soils also have different temperature insulation properties, where clay stays colder for longer versus sand, which will allow water in faster and dries out quicker. Animals that are going to nest in the soil, like our bees, like our reptiles, they need specific soils. And you don't have to modify large swaths of land. We're only talking about maybe 1 foot across and 18 inches deep, 2 feet deep. So it's easy to bring that diversity back. If you have a lot of bees, but you don't know what kind of soil you want to create to help them because that bee species has not necessarily been described in that way, or because you haven't had the time to identify the bees, some good news is that the nests that have been studied and quantified using the ternary diagram all land in this heavier sand to really heavy clay type soils. So you can put these into your yard or into your garden anywhere, even if it's around an HVAC unit or along the fence line, to try and improve the diversity of soil, as well as create spaces for bees to be nesting. Again, it doesn't have to be large spaces. So when we're installing, if we're putting in some dead wood or putting in some rockscapes, you can easily modify the sands and soils underneath those areas, as well as between plants. And again, it doesn't have to be huge. It just has to be 6 inches deeper than the frost line and maybe 18 inches across. So you should be solid with those measurements. And then we can look at, a wild setting to see how different soils are going to affect the way that the snow builds up, the vegetation communities, and everything else. And this creates different thermal gradients in the winter habitats. Another way that I typically do this, so here's a garden bed that we put in our backyard for some food gardens, with some thick limestone borders just to make it look more attractive. Simply lifting one of those stones, putting a hole in the weed liner, digging down about 18 inches because it doesn't get that cold where we live, filling it with local untreated mulch, and then just sprinkling over some of the sandy soil. The border is still very much supported. There's just a little area that is not, and it doesn't really change the outlook of the landscape, but it's now toad friendly, and toads, crickets, beetles, even pupating moths can find their way into that area and carry out their life cycle as necessary. Similarly, large rocks are quite often installed with a little bit of modification to the soil. However, there's generally no space left under those large rocks for animals to utilize it as shelter. And sometimes there's a weed liner that's put around. So if we kind of take a theoretical approach to this and understand that the soil is modified just enough to support the rock so that it doesn't fall over, and then sometimes a weed liner is put in. If this is the approach we're using, we simply want to make sure that there is a hole in the weed liner so that animals can access the soil that we have modified. In this modified soil column, we can simply add another column of soil that is different from the surrounding area. Or if we want to do something larger, you want to make sure the rock is still supported so that if something changes here, if animals are in here, this won't shift and crush anything that's in there, or simply just shift and cause problems in the landscape. But you can bury large logs underneath these rocks as well to create that natural process of woods breaking down and creating microhabitats for our wildlife to survive the winter and carry out their life cycles. So again, if you did that with these kind of large rock installs, it would still look the same, but it would now support amphibians, some of the mammals, lizards, and even newts that might be in your area. Burrowing animals are typically removed from our landscapes. Sorry, real fast. I just want to make sure I'm still connected to the internet. Burrowing animals are typically removed from our landscapes. And although we don't want to really introduce burrowing animals back into our gardens, especially like groundhogs or prairie dogs if you're in that area, because it would be dangerous. And you don't want to step outside and have a brand new hole that you can break your leg in. It's easy enough to recreate those spaces though. So burrows are important for a number of overwintering animals, including box turtles, toads, many different insects as well. And the way to recreate them is to design hideaways in raised beds is the easiest, but you can also just bury them in the ground. Just make sure that there are strong walls and strong ceilings so they won't cave in. You want to make sure that the areas are covered by at least 18 inches or more of soil for thermal insulation from the sun and for the winter. But again, if you are living in an area that is extremely cold, you probably want to go a little bit deeper than this. Tunnel should be 2 inches larger than your target wildlife. So if you're trying to go for box turtles, which can be about 4 to 5 inches in carapace, you should aim for a tunnel width of about 7 inches. And to be very clear, just because you've designed these tunnels for these animals, it doesn't mean they'll be used by those species, and quite often will be adopted by non-target wildlife that you may not want in the area. Some of the simple designs include putting in the drain pipes into rock walls, but then just simply modifying the back a little bit with some mulch or some sandy soils so that animals can dig down a little bit further. You can also create them using totes. Take the lid off, turn it over, and then cut holes on both sides so animals can move through it. You'll create these spaces. In a similar fashion, many of the denning organisms and burrowing animals that would be present in our landscape are no longer present. You can either create above ground shelters or below ground shelters. Above ground shelters aren't necessarily going to be great for overwintering organisms, but they will be great for the summer. However, if you modify the soil underneath, you can create spaces that's a little bit more dry and animals will go and overwinter in that space. Similarly, if there's enough room above ground, animals that use leaves to create nests will bring leaves into that area and create their own space. If you want to create a underground den, we can borrow some of the conservation tools used for tortoises and for burrowing owls, which honestly the most common thing they do is take large dog kennels, just the top of it, lay it down on the ground, cover the front with stone so it looks more natural, and then cover the whole thing with soil. You can also use mulch or wood chips to create that insulation that's necessary. And if you have a large piece of property, this is great for foxes, raccoons, possums, and really help out replacing the animals that would have dug out these larger caves for the wildlife that are in the area. Again, it's a really good idea to loosen up the soil on the bottom and to make sure that these areas drain so that nobody ends up drowning. Features that are important to include: make sure that you have sturdy walls and a good ceiling, loose soil on the bottom, and then vertical soils like you see in these caves here, are a little bit more difficult to create, but they can be done on rock walls or raised planter beds if you're careful. But honestly, I do not recommend it, simply because the chance of it caving or sliding over really does become a problem. Similarly, if you are lucky enough to have rock walls on your property, these probably already have a bunch of soil starting to form around them, but you can modify, without disturbing the wall, areas around the side that will help create either the tunnels or the vertical soil. Another option for creating summer and winter habitat uses this idea of the volcano irrigation method. And I'm showing you pictures from the Southwest because there's not a lot of vegetation to disrupt the view of what we're talking about. But in the Northeast, this method is still used in areas where it's hard to irrigate, or you want to simply do a flooding type watering for the plants that have been transplanted. Although this is a good way to do watering and can create some microhabitats, a better way to improve this, especially for our urban areas where we may want a little bit of structure, or for trees where you can't get in and weed. So in this example, my neighbors were looking for a weed-free kind of approach because they couldn't mow close enough to the tree to prevent the Bermuda grass from growing, and they couldn't get in there and weed whack without damaging the tree. So all we did is took the volcano well that was already present and put in some support rocks and then some mulch to create a matrix that the water could easily move through, as well as organisms could easily move in and out of. Then we put a supporting layer of cardboard in this. For this install, we use cardboard, but you can use metal grates if you want to, if it's for something longer, or any other sturdy material that will withstand being the weight on top of it, of whatever you put on top. We then put around some border rocks to just make a clean look, and then fill the area with gravel. This is now pervious to water. The tree is easily irrigated. The trunk flare is not covered, so it will continue to grow in a healthy fashion, and it looks pretty decent. A side cut is, however, that in this wet area, there's a more damp space for wildlife to go. So crickets and toads love this area because it's in Texas, but it will also work in the Northeast. The rocks that are on top, again, you want to make sure that there's enough support underneath that this doesn't crush anything. And then the loose soil that's already present in here is allowing the water to infiltrate pretty quickly, and these animals can burrow down if they need to for the winter. Native plant communities, typically removed. So designing any landscape with native plants as much as possible will help bring those native plant communities back and the animals that are dependent upon those species. Of course, follow design architecture and guidelines to create that beautiful aesthetic. Because a lot of people are confusing using native plants with creating a wildscape. And wildscapes have their place for sure, but in places that have high fires, have lots of people, or even just a lot of pests, it's understandable that neighbors are going to get upset when an area looks like an unkept weed lot instead of a garden that matches the overall landscape. And it's easy enough to go in and organize these plants so that people appreciate what they're looking at. And the way to select plants for that kind of organization is to make sure that you're planting within the range and the habitat that you have is suitable for the plant. This includes sun exposure, water availability, and soil type. Ask yourself what pollinators and insects are going to utilize those plants. A lot of different organizations are starting to develop a connection or network of pollinators that are utilizing the flowers. So it's a good thing to understand. In my most recent book, I tried to list out all of the bees that had been collected on the plants for the species that are included in that document. Similarly, ask if it's going to be producing seeds that birds might use, or if it's going to produce habitat that might work for nesting, and then how other animals might be using these plants. And then, of course, what is the response to trimming? Some plants don't do well with trimming. Other plants do great with trimming. A lot of the coneflowers, you can cut them back once or twice a year. But a number of shrubs like Texas sage, blueberries, even American holly do really well if you trim them over and over again. And you can shape them to show people that what you're doing is in fact intentional. Sunflowers, on the other hand, this landowner learned the hard way, grow however they want to, and you can't really trim them. So in the winter, this place looks phenomenal. Everything is trimmed up. But in this season, they just had an amazing display of sunflowers that they had to keep tying back and keeping off the sidewalk. Similarly, with pruning, you all probably are aware that deer really love plants and will kill plants pretty readily if they are not protected. When I was working at Westchester Land Trust, we accidentally realized that if we put up these deer cages and carefully secured them, the deer were able to browse the plants once they reached the side of the cage, which is what these plants are supposed to be doing. They're supposed to be feeding the local wildlife. But the deer weren't able to get in and kill these plants either through rubbing their antlers or simply over consuming them. So if you can pick the right kind of cage or even shape your cages to a design that you want a topiary, you can get deer to kind of work with you to keep things neat and tidy. You can feed the deer, but you can also protect your plants, which then will feed the insects that are dependent on those plants as well. Water in both summer and winter is hard to come by in urban environments. The water that is available in urban environments is typically going to be polluted by road salts, overall pollution in general, and just runoff, all the things that carry chemicals that aren't supposed to be in our water supply. The best way to provide water in the winter is to create shallow basins with rough edges that will allow any animals that fall in to crawl out. You want to place these in the full sun, use a dark rock or a dark surface so they can absorb solar heat that will help melt the ice. You can also use heated pumps if you have access to those. In nature, we should be seeing running creeks. The sun melts things. Again, there's different temperature gradients. So the snow melts a little bit, and animals typically have access to water throughout the day and throughout all the seasons. Similar in the summer, if you're trying to create large, clean, temporary water resources, trying to emulate some of the emergent wetlands or the vernal pools is important, especially for amphibians and many of our insects in carrying out their life cycle. Dry wood or dead wood and leaf litter are typically hard to find in urban environments as well, but they're really easy to bring into our gardens. And you can do it with clear log borders or mulch borders. You can tuck mulch piles away underneath shrubs in the dirt, as I showed earlier. You can utilize stumps, roots, trunks as centerpieces. A few people are really starting to catch on to the idea that a fallen root crown, once it's cleaned out, can be absolutely stunning. So I was really surprised to see a place selling one of these for a landscape design. If you're lucky enough to have a tree fall over in your yard and not damage anything, I highly recommend trying to build around that newly created vertical soil because so many wildlife utilize that space. Similarly, some of the wooden resources that people without realizing are trying to emulate, they do it by bringing in bee hotels, bird boxes, or shelter boxes. Now, bee hotels, most bees do not chew out wood tunnels. They reutilize ones that beetles have already made, with exception being the carpenter bee and a few, no, actually the carpenter bee is the biggest exception. So in the wild, what we're looking at is bee tunnels that are beetle tunnels that have been excavated while the beetle are feeding on this log. They mature and evolve into, or metamorphose into beetles. Then these holes are freshly open and clean, and bees will utilize these to create their cells. You can, if you want to, drill holes into wood stumps this way. However, as this dries and cracks, it will allow those cells to dry out in an unnatural way. or let parasitoids have access to it. So this will still provide bee nesting sites, but the mortality will increase year after year. Building your own is the best option. And this is because the way native bees nest is they produce females in the deepest cells, and then the last few cells of any tunnel are going to be male. If we have cells that are, or tunnels that are too short, that are typically sold at retail stores or online, what ends up happening is not enough females are being produced, more males are being produced, and these males end up harassing the females. And this also doesn't have the, sorry, misspoke there. This has too many nests in an area that can become infected with pollen mites and parasitoids that are then able to find all the nests in one go. So you want to produce bee hotels that are low in number and can easily be spread throughout the landscape like they would naturally occur. Similarly, when we're looking at bird boxes or shelter boxes, these are emulating or mimicking hollow wood that would be existing in dead tree branches, live trees, as well as fallen tree trunks. Some animals require a specific size hole for entering into their nest. Some animals like specific shapes. There is a fantastic book called Birdhouses that explains the different shapes and sizes that different birds will utilize, and definitely worth checking out. Larger animals like possums and squirrels will require larger holes for them to access and carry their leaf litter and everything else to create their nests in this. Another option that you can do if you have a larger property is if you have a tree fall down, instead of doing just a wood pile, create a wall around that wood pile with some of the thinner cut but thicker pieces of the tree. And this will just create a denning space that animals like possums, raccoons, foxes can really move materials into and create their own little den. And help their populations out as well. Similarly, as the wood is breaking down naturally, like I said earlier, different stages of the wood, being it brand new and healthy or really decayed, is going to support different wildlife. Typically, when arborists leave a pile of mulch around, this happened at a number of my friends' houses. This is my friend Mike. That when they go to move that mulch in a year or two, they find turtles, and they're shocked to find that turtles would be nesting in there. And it's like, well, yes, because there's no longer these dying, decomposing root masses that should exist in our landscape, because we don't like them. We cut them down and we tear everything up. So allowing some of that wood to break down is important. I understand for people, any homeowner, you don't want this to be next to your house. You can be concerned about fungus or any of the insects that be breaking down this wood, spreading to the wooden beams of the house. So let this happen away from your home. Similarly, let that wood be a little bit more wet than anything else. The organisms that are able to live on that wet wood as it breaks down are not going to be able to survive on the wood that is in your house, and therefore there shouldn't be a transfer of any concern for damaging the wooden structures. Things that you can add to your yard include bird boxes. You can add hollow logs. I've had the best success by reaching out to local arborists and seeing if they'll hold any that they come across. Sometimes it takes a lot of convincing, but typically if you tell them that you'll pay them, or simply just take large pieces off their hands that they wouldn't be able to use for sewing for wood or anything else, they become amenable to letting you take wood from them. If you are putting out bird boxes, a good idea is to fill that bird box halfway with dry leaves or animal fur for the winter. This will emulate many of the animals that are missing. Various squirrels, possums, raccoons create nests that then other animals would utilize in the winter. But again, in our urban environments, those animals are typically extirpated or removed, as well as the overall denning sites for them. So by putting leaf litter back into a bird box, you're actually creating a space that some birds will go into, some like harvestmen, various crickets, various insects will try and find that space to spend the winter. Choosing wooden logs that have peeling bark is an important addition to any yard. That space is used by a number of beetles and moths, as well as mourning cloaks and commas for spending the winter. Both mourning cloaks and commas get into that area as adults. And then on the warm days, that's why you see them first in the spring, is because they're already fully formed and they come out on the warm days. Adding decomposing wood above and below ground will serve as nesting and overwintering sites for a variety of animals. And just by doing it, you're allowing those animals to find that resource instead of necessarily trying to target one species in specific. Similarly, as wood breaks down, the bacteria and the fungus that are breaking it down are creating heat, and that creates a thermal insulation that's just a little bit warmer than the surrounding environment and important for a number of animals trying to survive the winter. If you're trying to feed the birds in the winter, you may already be putting suet out. And if you think about it, it's a little odd to be providing animal fat to animals that don't eat mammals or large predatory wildlife. And the reason that this suet is important is because these birds used to feed on the carcasses that wolves and mountain lions and other predators would have left behind. Once animals are fed on, some of that fat is left. It's allowed to desiccate, and then the birds go and feed on that in the winter. However, because we don't have these animals, we don't have those carcasses, and then the birds are left without the fat resources. So putting suet out is important. You can also plant native berry-producing shrubs, and then, of course, deadwood and standing snags for any insects that might be active for the insect foraging animals like woodpeckers. A list of good species to consider that are going to produce nuts or berries that can be utilized in the winter is listed right here. If you're interested, feel free to come back and look at this. And it adds a little bit of color to your landscape, which is also wonderful. Last, I want to talk about climate change. Last year, some of you may have heard that the USDA released a new zone hardiness map. And a lot of people were excited because they're now in a warmer zone and they can plant new plants that are in warmer areas. Yes, the zone hardiness map is not really helpful for understanding what things are native to your area. What the zone hardiness map is doing is explaining where are the coldest temperatures or what are the lowest expected temperatures in winter. The newest map uses 30 years and averages the lowest temperatures that were experienced in each region. And unfortunately, this is leading to a small error, well, a very large error, but it's tracking a very different change. So with climate change, we are going to see warmer winters overall. We're going to see later frosts. We're going to see more days with above freezing temperatures, and we're going to see less nights with freezing temperatures. And that's where the shifting north occurred because they took these averages. However, with climate change, the strong polar jet stream that crosses or that circles the globe and corrals the cold air, when this cold air isn't here and it's warm, it pushes that down. It helps break down this jet stream and it makes it weaker. That's what's creating these Arctic blasts, the ones that we're experiencing this week, the one that made the news in 2021. These Arctic blasts are going to create later last frosts and heavy freezes. They're going to create sporadic record-setting lows and polar vortexes, again, like we're experiencing right now. And that's going to lead to mortality events in both plants and animals. So for example, if we look at the forecast for this Wednesday across the country, some areas are seeing expected temperatures for their zone, but others are not. The best breakdown is in the polar vortex of 2021 that hit. On the new map, all this yellow is supposed to be about 10 degrees as the lowest temperature reached in Fahrenheit. However, we were seeing below zero temperatures based on this graph here. This isn't just bad for the plants that we're planting. I went out and did plant surveys right after this plant vortex or this polar vortex hit, and native plants were dying or already dead. Similarly, I got sent out to Corpus Christi the following week and was counting dead sea turtles and a whole bunch of other animal that had died because of this storm. This is going to continue. So the way that you plan for this is to take an inventory of your yard, select plants that are based on recent record lows, not the new plant hardiness map. So if you know that in the last 5 years you've reached -15, don't plant plants that can only survive to -5. It's just not going to work out well in the end. We also want to provide ample shelters for winter wildlife. You can add branches on top of snow, which will create that windbreak for animals to get into. You can cut bushes back so that they create it naturally. Provide deep burrows that, again, below that freeze line. Provide mulch piles that are deep, thick enough, and provide den sites so that animals can access those areas and get away from the winter cold. And then, of course, any extra food and water for the active animals that might be present in those storms. So to end on a happy note, let's talk about our meadows and our full sun kind of gardens and the things that we can do to really help create robust yearly habitat, as well as some of the things we do for the snow. So because we are suspending that plant succession and we aren't going to be coming from a forest, it's important to spread a thin layer of locally sourced wood chips every few years. You don't have to do it every year, just every few years. You can also sprinkle manure around here and there to replicate some of the missing animals and the abundance of those animals. Bury large branches and logs or piles of wood chips, and do this every few years to renew that resource while letting it also carry on its natural life cycle to provide those microclimates for the animals that need it. Spot mow areas where short-lived perennials are growing. So if you have an area where goldenrod is encroaching, but you want the black-eyed Susans to grow there, definitely mow that down a little bit more often. Only mow up to half of an area or trim up half of an area so that animals that are in those stems are left in 50% of your yard, and if they are taken away, then you're not going to completely remove them from your landscape. And then in the winter, make sure you're clearing snow from some of the areas. Go outside and walk on your plants, walk on the areas, let that soil get exposed again so that birds looking for seeds can access it. The soil itself can get cold, and then any animals that are browsing some of the vegetation that might still be growing can get down there as well. Kind of think about your landscape in this kind of model instead of the original plant succession, and identify all of the resources that are missing from your habitat as they should occur in that natural succession, but also that would be specifically used by local wildlife. Try and keep those resources fresh, especially for the overwintering animals. And then also feel free to disturb logs and stones and soils, because animals were doing that. Bears were tipping over fallen logs, woodpeckers were peeling them apart, and that disturbance helps stop those resources from really sealing with the soil and no longer providing shelter or access that many animals need because they can't create them themselves. And with that, the conclusions I hope everyone was able to take from this is that our gardens are out of balance and require management. Landscape designs can be created with with really great habitat as the end product, and it only takes a little bit of thoughtful use of native plants, incorporating that diverse soil, placing shelters, rocks, and water and wood into the landscape that animals can use, and then trying to mimic the absent animals in the best way possible to emulate the natural processes. And then remember, native plants can be trimmed, shaped, and sculpted for crisp looks and create important structure that wildlife are going to use. And with that, I will take any questions. If you're interested in picking up some of the topics discussed today, it is presented in text in my book, Inviting Pollinators and Other Wildlife into Your Garden. Otherwise, it's going to be on YouTube, and there are other videos I have on YouTube for free. If you are also interested in some of this more ecologically based conservation approach, that will be coming out in my next book, hopefully in 2025, called Habitats and Homes. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Amanda.
Thank you so much, Sean. That's been so informative. We are now going to go into the Q&A, and Vinaya Frank, our Vice President and Chair of our programming, is going to moderate that.
Thanks, Amanda and Sean. What a great talk. So much information to think about, like when you're planning your winter habitat. So enriching. Thank you so much for that. We have a few questions that came in the chat, and I'm going to read them out, and then we can take any additional. And people, feel free to unmute yourself and announce your question after the three that I have on the list already. Someone asked, fallen trees, should I leave them intact as used trees or cut into logs? I want to best sequester carbon and, of course, leave the best habitat for our wildlife.
Yeah, so that's a very good question. And it really comes down to how it fits into your landscape. So if a tree falls over the street, clearly don't leave it intact. It needs to be removed so that access can be achieved. For carbon sequestration, as long as it is allowed to decay or even get buried, is going to be one option to sequester some of the carbon. The best way to sequester carbon is actually to not let it decay at all, and that's not what we want in this situation. So things getting turned into furniture or moved into bogs would permanently secure that carbon, but letting it just feed back into the natural nutrient cycles and allowing it to build the soils as it should will sequester the carbon as it naturally would have, but some of that will be released as animals are breaking it down.
Wonderful. Thank
you. Does that answer the question?
Mary, is there anything more that you were looking for, or does that answer your question?
No, that answers my question. The trees fell over in a big storm, and it's out in my front yard, which is all woods. So I think that's good. This was a fabulous talk. I can't wait to listen to the recording again. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, with the fallen one, if you want to cut up that wood and move it around, like, you're not going to affect the carbon storage at that point. How you reutilize that wood in your yard will affect it, though. So if you let it decay, or if you ship it off and have somebody burn it, like, that's definitely going to release more than if you let it sit somewhere in your yard and create birdhouses or benches or any of those kind of structures.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
And Betty asked, please give a resource to go over the steps again for the soil area modification for amphibians. And again, I want to remind that we will have a recording of this available at the end of it. So if there's something that you missed, you can re-listen to the recording and take notes. But if there's anything additional, Sean, that you want to add as a resource that people can look at for, I know we covered a few amphibians, but is there like a comprehensive long list of different soils that different kinds of amphibians, bees, and other wildlife prefer?
Yes, that is a really good question. And there is, unfortunately, not a really good comprehensive resource available. There is a book called Creating Wildlife Habitat. And unfortunately, I'm traveling, so I can't just like turn around and pull it off my bookshelf. I'm pretty sure it's called Creating Wildlife Habitat. And they talk about how wood and snags and that decomposing structure creates space for amphibians to overwinter. So check out that book.
Do you know the author?
I don't, but I can message you after I'm back home and that gets sent out. But overall, understanding that in the environment where most of the amphibians are going is either in the Northeast, they're either going to be overwintering in water, so you need deep water environments with leaf litter at the bottom, or they're going to be trying to find wet areas that aren't going to freeze. And that includes decomposing trees, that includes rocks, caves, and crevices. So each species is going to be a little bit different. Your spring peepers and wood frogs, those are surprisingly able to freeze. So those are the ones that are going to show up first in the spring. They're the ones that start calling as soon as you have a warm day and there's still snow on the ground. So simply providing them with, again, loose organic material that they can move into and out of really easily is going to provide the best habitat without being specific to a research paper.
Thank you. And Michelle asked, who's the author of the book Birdhouses that you recommend, Sean?
I believe it's the Audubon Society. Again, I will. How about I message you, um, Vinny? How about I message you like a list of books that I would recommend for creating those spaces?
Yes.
But yeah, the birdhouse book. I think it's out by Audubon, and it has amazing designs, like how to create everything. So I'll make sure to send that over.
Also, have you looked at the DNR website? Because that also has like by bird type, they have list of bird houses and different designs with like the key requirements of like the hole and what height it should be planted at and what have you. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that resource to for the public.
Yeah, that is also a great resource. Last I checked, it didn't have as many species as the book did. But they might be copying each other now and integrating. So.
All right, so I'm going to open it up to the rest of the group to see if there are any additional questions. And you don't have to unmute if you're more comfortable just typing it out in the chat. I'm happy to kind of read it aloud on your behalf. And if there are no questions, I'm happy to close out early and give you 8 or 9 minutes back in your day.
This is Betty. Can you hear me?
Hi, Betty.
Hi, Sean. And I just wanted to follow up. I did ask about the amphibians. I am just so thankful that you gave me a way to look at smaller areas and not get overwhelmed. And I do have a variety on a half-acre lot. And so I am more enthused with just being able to say I can do a variety of things in smaller places and not get overwhelmed. And the idea of going under the ground with what you did in your garden with the rocks and stuff, oh my gosh, just highlight for me. But thank you, so many ideas. Thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Betty.
We have one more question. Are toad houses worth looking into?
Toad houses are really good for summer shelter. The thing to understand about toad abodes, if you will, those come from the UK. So they're dealing with a very different environment and a lot less sunny days. So if you put up a toad abode, I recommend covering it with mulch or making sure that it's in a very shaded area. They should never be exposed to direct sunlight. Similarly, if you want to attract tree frogs to your yard, they love PVC pipe. And the way that most tree frog researchers go and sample the wild is they put up PVC pipes in shaded areas where it's wet, and then they just go and look inside, and you'll find all the tree frogs hanging out in there. So if you have any of the tree frogs in your yard that you just want to check on them, like put a white PVC pipe somewhere that you're going to access. It's not going to hit with direct sunlight, and you can just look in and see your little buddy hanging out. It's kind of awesome. But yes, toad abodes, do it. Put them in damp areas, shaded areas. Do not let sun hit them. And again, it's just that pretty much it's the above ground shelter that I showed in this talk, just using a terracotta pot for the easiest thing. But you can make it with all sorts of material as long as there's enough space for them to crawl under and stay damp.
Hi, my name is Ranika. I have a question about the leaf litter that you were talking about, and I have big areas in the yard with like very mature trees, so I leave all the leaves down there, but I did find a few spring ephemerals this year, so would those be okay, or should I still disturb the leaves a little?
Did you say spring ephemerals?
Yes.
Yes. So a lot of your spring ephemerals can grow through like a loose leaf litter or a thin leaf layer. But if the leaves are where you planted them, if they're naturally just building up there, or if the leaves are just too dense, just in the late winter, clear those leaves away a little bit so that the soil is being in pockets, and the ephemerals will find that light and then grow up above them.
And does that apply? Okay, great. And does that apply to ferns too?
ferns typically are pretty strong growers, and they'll grow through thick leaf layers. The only one that I think that won't do that is hay-scented fern. But if you have any of the large osmundias, they'll do pretty good in thick leaf layers.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Great talk.
I have a question, Sean, if I may.
Sure.
So we have in our backyard, we have this large wisteria forest. Again, it's an invasive, and we're working actively to get rid of it. But the massiveness of this wisteria forest is what worries me a little bit if I'm kind of killing the habitat as I'm taking out the invasives. So this fall, we did like blanket spray on with glyphosate, and again, that was kind of intentional because we've been working on it for 7 years without making a single dent in how widespread this wisteria is. And I'm talking like they're really thick trunks, like they're 6 inches to like sometimes even a foot wide. I mean, it's like a 50-year-old old growth, like that's no one's been taken care of. So we decided to do that, and I'm like seeing all this large swath of like dead, wisteria trunks and branches, and I was a little worried that I'm kind of destroying some of the habitat that probably some of this wildlife, like birds that don't necessarily eat the berries, but are using that as shelter to kind of, to build their nests and what have you. So in that process where people are kind of taking out invasives and eventually I will add something in that transition mode, is there anything that I can do to help the wildlife kind of adjust in this phase?
Yeah. So the rough answer is the majority of animals that we're using that wisteria are not going, there's nothing you can do to make their life easier. But that's okay, because the natural processes are supposed to be rough naturally. Like it's kind of mean to think about, but the reality of nature is there is no kind death in nature, and there's no kind transition for a lot of things. So accept that and be okay with the disturbance that you're doing. Mm-hmm. That said, there are a number of things you can do to kind of expedite the next step that should be happening, which if you're allowing a lot of sunlight to hit the forest floor, plant sunflowers. Mm-hmm. It's going to help suppress invasive species. It's going to provide a lot of butterflies with a host plant, because I think 7 species use sunflowers. A number of bees utilize it as pollen, and a number of birds eat the seeds. So that's just going to be just a fabulous plant to put in the ground, and it grows in 3 months. Like you get to see that change. Try and pick small areas, especially on the periphery of where that wisteria damage is happening, that you start doing your transplants too. So bring in the plants that you want to see growing there, and then make sure that you are actively preventing any new invasive species from growing there or any new vines from popping up. And then you can kind of just concentrically move in to the center or the worst part of that wisteria area. However, if you use glyphosate, it's not like you burned anything or anything. So anything that's like using the wood for a platform to grow on or nesting in that structure, they're going to be fine. You can also put vines, native vines, that'll grow over that wood as well to kind of bring back the shelter that would have been there. But think of it as what you're doing is a forest fire going through, and the animals are going to come back, and that habitat isn't there, so they have to find it somewhere else in the landscape. And the goal is to allow there to be habitat for these organisms. So it's okay to be in the cycle and not necessarily have that perfect habitat that you want, that you're aiming for.
Mm-hmm. That was very helpful, because I was really stressing out if I'm destroying a whole bunch of things in my effort to remove invasives from the backyard. Thank you so much. Yep. Do we have any more questions? I know we're cutting close to 7:30. So if there are any more questions, again, you have Sean's email, and feel free to reach out to either him or us. Any one of our Wild Ones. Use the Wild Ones Baltimore Gmail email address to send us any questions, and we will send out a presentation and the book recommendations from Sean and a recording. So you'll have all of this information available for you to, again, kind of review whatever you missed, or if you want to just re-listen to all the good points he had in the presentation. So thank you, Sean. It was quite a treat, as I anticipated, and not surprised at all. A lot of information, a lot of enrichment for me to take back home, and hope this applies to all of the people that attended in the meeting today. And thank you so much. We hope to have you again on one of the other subjects, because this was just so inspiring.
Awesome. Yeah, please, anytime. I will make it happen, even if I'm presenting from a hotel in Texas.